Chapter 2. The International Team. Yigal Yadin recounted the events of 1967 to David Price Jones in an interview conducted earlier in 1968. He was aware, he said, that other scrolls were around, and that Kando, the dealer involved in the original discovery, knew where they were. He therefore sent other staff members from Hebrew University, accompanied by 3 officers, to Kando's house in Bethlehem. Kando was taken under escort to Tel Aviv. When he emerged after 5 days of interrogation, he took the officers back to his home and produced a scroll which had been hidden there for 6 years. This proved to be an extremely important discovery, the Temple Scroll, first published in 1977. Price Jones also interviewed Father DeVoe, who was highly indignant at what had occurred. According to Price Jones, DeVoe called the Israelis Nazis. His face flushed as he claimed the Israelis would use the conquest of Jerusalem as a pretext to move all the Dead Sea Scrolls from the Rockefeller and house them in their Shrine of the Book. He also feared for both his own position and his access to the Qumran text, because, as Price Jones discovered, Father DeVoe had refused to allow any Jews to work on the scrolls in the Rockefeller. DeVoe's fears, in fact, proved groundless. In the political and military aftermath of the Six-Day War, the Israelis had other matters on their plate. Yadin and Professor Biran, who from 1961 to 1974 was director of the Israeli Department of Antiquities, were therefore prepared to maintain the status quo, and DeVoe was left in charge of the scrolls with the stipulation that their publication be speeded up. A cache of some 800 scrolls had been discovered in Cave 4 in 1952. To deal with the sheer quantity of this material, an international committee of scholars had been formed, each member of which was assigned certain specific texts for study, interpretation, translation, and eventual publication. Owing nominal allegiance to the Jordanian Department of Antiquities, the committee in reality functioned under the virtually supreme authority of Father DeVoe. He subsequently became editor-in-chief of the definitive series of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the multi-volume Discoveries in the Judean Desert, published by Oxford University Press. He was to retain his prominence in the field until his death in 1977. Roland DeVoe was born in Paris in 1903 and studied for the priesthood between 1925 and 1928 at the seminary of St. Sulpice, learning Arabic and Aramaic in the process. In 1929 he joined the Dominican order, under whose auspices he was sent to the École Biblique in Jerusalem. He began teaching regularly at the École in 1934 and served as its director from 1945 until 1965. Between 1938 and 1953, he edited the École's magazine, Revue Biblique. To those who met him or knew him, DeVoe was a striking and memorable personality, something of a character. A heavy smoker, he wore a bushy beard, glasses, and a dark beret. He also invariably wore his white monk's robes even on excavations. A charismatic man, known for his vigor and enthusiasm, he was an eloquent lecturer and an engaging raconteur with a flair for public relations. This made him an ideal spokesman for the enterprise on which he was engaged. One of his former colleagues described him to us as a good scholar, if not a particularly good archaeologist. But behind his personable facade, DeVoe was ruthless, narrow-minded, bigoted, and fiercely vindictive. Politically, he was decidedly right-wing. In his youth, he had been a member of Action Française, the militant Catholic and nationalist movement which burgeoned in France between the two world wars, which extolled the cult of blood and soil, and expressed more than a little sympathy for the dictatorships in Germany, Italy, and on Franco's triumph, Spain. Certainly he was ill-suited to preside over the research on the Dead Sea Scrolls. In the first place, he was not just a practicing Catholic, but also a monk, and this could hardly conduce to balance or impartiality in his handling of extremely sensitive, even explosive religious material. Moreover, he was hostile to Israel as a political entity, always referring to the country as Palestine. On a more personal level, he was also anti-Semitic. One of his former colleagues testifies to his resentment at Israel's attending his lectures. After interviewing DeVoe, David Price Jones stated that I found him an irascible brute, slightly potty too. According to Megan Broshi, currently director of the Israeli Shrine of the Book, DeVoe was a rabid anti-Semite and a rabid anti-Israeli, but was the best partner one could ask for. This was the man, then, to whom responsibility for the Dead Sea Scrolls was entrusted. In 1953, the Board of Trustees of the Rockefeller Museum, whose president at the time was DeVoe himself, had requested nominations from the various foreign archaeological schools, British, French, German, and American, then active in Jerusalem. No Israelis were invited, despite the proximity of the well-trained staff of Hebrew University. Each school was asked for funds to help sustain the cost of the work. The first scholar to be appointed under DeVoe's authority was Professor Frank Cross, then associated with McCormick Theological Seminary in Chicago and with the Albright Institute in Jerusalem. Cross was the Albrights' nominee and began to work in Jerusalem in the summer of 1953. The material assigned to him consisted of specifically biblical texts, scroll commentaries, that is, found in Cave 4 at Qumran on the various books of the Old Testament. Material of a similar nature was assigned to Monsignor Patrick Skehan, also from the United States, at the time of his appointment. He was director of the Albright Institute. Father Jean Starkey from France was nominated by the École Biblique. At the time, he was attached to the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique. Starkey, an expert in Aramaic, was assigned the corpus of material in that language. Dr. Klaus Huno Hunzinger was nominated by the Germans. He was assigned one particular text known as the War Scroll, as well as a body of material transcribed on papyrus rather than on parchment. He subsequently left the team and was eventually replaced by another French priest, Father Maurice Bellet. Father Joseph Milik, a Polish priest resettled in France, was another nominee of the École Biblique, with which he was also affiliated. A disciple and close confidant of DeVoe, Milik received an especially important corpus of material. It included a quantity of Old Testament apocrypha. It also included pseudographical writings, text in which a later commentator would try to impart authority to his words by ascribing them to earlier prophets and patriarchs. Most important of all, it included what was called sectarian material. Material pertaining specifically to the community at Qumran. their teachings, rituals, and disciplines. The British nominee to the team was John M. Allegro, then working for his doctorate at Oxford under Professor Godfrey R. Driver. Allegro went to Jerusalem as an agnostic. He was the only member of the team not to have specific religious affiliations. He was also the only philologist in the group and already had 5 publications to his credit in academic journals. He was thus the only one to have established a reputation for himself before working on the scrolls. All the others were unknown at the time and made their names only through their work with the text assigned to them. Allegro was assigned biblical commentaries which proved in fact to be sectarian material, of the kind assigned to Millet, and a body of so-called wisdom literature, hymns, psalms, sermons, and exhortations of a moral and poetic character. Allegro's material seemed to have been rather more explosive than anyone at the time had anticipated, and he himself was something of a maverick. He had certainly no compunction about breaking the consensus DeVoe was trying to establish, and as we shall see, as soon to be ousted from the team and replaced by John Strugnell, also enrolled in a doctoral program at Oxford. Strugnell became a disciple of Frank Cross. According to what principles was the material divided, distributed, and assigned? How was it determined who would deal with what? Professor Cross, when asked this question on the telephone, replied that the matter was resolved with discussion, and easy consensus, and with the blessing of DeVoe. Certain things were obvious. Those of us who had full-time professorships could not take unknown and more complex problems, so we took biblical and the simplest material from the point of view of identification of material and putting stuff into columns and whatnot. The people who were specialists in Aramaic, particularly Starkey, obviously the Aramaic stuff went to him. The interest of the several scholars, the opportunities for research, pretty much laid out what each of us would do. This was quickly agreed to, and DeVoe gave his blessing. We didn't sit down and vote, and there was no conflict in this. Basically, the team worked by consensus. Professor Cross makes it clear that each member of the team knew what all the others were doing. All the material had been laid out and arranged in a single room. The scholarly and anyone was free to wander about and see how his colleagues were progressing. Footnote. The scullery was a large room containing some 20 trusty tables where scroll fragments were pressed under sheets of glass. Photographs dating from the 1950s show a complete and appalling lack of any environmental control for the material, much of which was already deteriorating. Windows are open, for example, curtains blowing in the breeze. No attempts has been made to exclude heat, humidity, wind, dust, or direct sunlight. It is all a far cry from the conditions in which the scrolls are housed today. They are now in a basement room under a special amber light. Temperature and humidity are rigorously controlled. Each fragment is held between sheets of thin silk stretched in perspex frames. End of footnote. They would also, of course, help one another on problems requiring one or another individual's special expertise. But this also meant that if any one of the team were dealing with controversial or explosive material, all the others would know. On this basis, Allegro, to the end of his life, was to insist that important and controversial material was being withheld, or at least delayed in its release by his colleagues. Another independent-minded scholar who later became involved reports that he was in the 1960s instructed to go slow, to proceed in a deliberately desultory fashion, so that the crazies will get tired and go away. DeVoe wanted, so far as it was possible, to avoid embarrassing the Christian establishment. Some of the Qumran material was clearly deemed capable of doing precisely that. It was certainly convenient for DeVoe that until 1967 the Rockefeller Museum lay in the Jordanian territory of East Jerusalem. Israelis were forbidden to cross into the sector, and this provided the anti-Semitic DeVoe with a handy pretext to exclude Israeli experts, even though his team of international scholars was supposed at the theoretically to reflect the widest diversity of interest and approaches. If politics kept the Israelis out of East Jerusalem, they could easily have been provided with photographs or with some other access to the material. No such access was granted. We raised the issue with Professor Biran, governor of the Israeli sector of Jerusalem at the time and subsequently director of the Israeli Department of Antiquities. He stated that the Jordanian authorities had been adamant in refusing to let Sukenik or any other Israeli scholar enter their sector of Jerusalem. In his capacity of governor, Biran had replied by authorizing DeVoe's committee to meet in the Israeli sector and offering them safe conducts. The offer was refused. Biran then suggested that individual scrolls or fragments be brought over to be examined by Israeli experts. This suggestion was similarly rejected. Of course they could have come, Professor Biran concluded, but they felt that they had possession of the scrolls and would not let anyone else take them. In the existing political climate, the scrolls were a fairly low priority, and no official pressure was brought to bear on this academic intransience. Let's try that again. In the existing political climate, the scrolls were a fairly low priority, and no official pressure was brought to bear on this academic intransigence. The situation was rendered even more absurd by the fact that the Israelis, first at Hebrew University and then at the specially created Shrine of the Book, had 7 important scrolls of their own, and 3 originally purchased by Sukenik, and the 4 Yigal Yadin managed to purchase in New York. The Israelis seem to have pursued and published their research more or less responsibly. They were, after all, accountable to Yadin and Biran, to the government, to public opinion, and the academic world in general. But the team at the Rockefeller emerged in a rather less favorable light. Funded by substantial donations, enjoying time, leisure, and freedom, they convey the impression of an exclusive club of self-proclaimed elite, almost medieval in their attitude to their monopolization of the material. The scholarly in which they conducted their research has a quasi-monastic atmosphere about it. One is reminded again of the sequestration of learning in the name of the rose, and the experts granted access to the scholarly arrogated such power and prestige to themselves that outsiders were easily convinced of the justness of their attitude, as Professor James B. Robinson, director of another more responsible team which translated the text found in the Egyptian desert at Nag Hammadi, said to us. Manuscript discoveries bring out the worst instincts in otherwise normal scholars. If the international team were high-handed in monopolizing their material, they were no less so in interpreting it. In 1954, just when the team were beginning their work, the dangers had already been anticipated by a Jesuit scholar, Robert North. Regarding the date of the scrolls, or rather the triple date of their composition, transcription, and storage, there has recently attained a relative consensus which is both reassuring and disquieting. It is reassuring insofar as it proceeds from such a variety of converging lines of evidence, and provides a working hypothesis as basis of discussion. But there is a danger of a false security. It is important to emphasize the frailty of the evidences themselves. North's warnings were to be ignored. During the course of the subsequent decade, a consensus view, to use the term and Robert Eisenman's, was indeed to emerge or be imposed by the international team working under DeVoe at the Rockefeller. A rigid orthodoxy of interpretation evolved, from which any deviation was tantamount to heresy. This orthodoxy of interpretation, which grew progressively more dogmatic over the years, was enunciated in its entirety by Father Millet and published in France in 1957 under the title Dix ans de découvertes dans des déserts de Juda. 2 years later, Millet's work was to be translated into English by another member of DeVoe's international team, John Strugnell. By that time, the first English formulation of the consensus view had already appeared, The Ancient Library of Qumran, by Professor Frank Cross, Strugnell's mentor, in 1958. The consensus view was summarized and given its final polishing touches by Father DeVoe himself in a series of lectures given to the British Academy in 1959 and published in 1961 as L'archéologie et les manuscrits de la mer Morte. By then, its tenets were soundly entrenched. Anyone who presumed to challenge them did not at severe risk to his credibility. Anyone who presumed to challenge them did so at severe risk to his credibility. In 1971, on Father DeVoe's death, an extraordinary situation developed. Although he did not in any legal sense own the scrolls, he nevertheless bequeathed his rights to them to one of his colleagues, Father Pierre Benot, another Dominican and subsequently DeVoe's successor as head of the international team and of the École Biblique. For Father Benot, actually to inherit DeVoe's rights, privileges, and prerogatives of access and control was as a scholastic procedure unprecedented. From a legal point of view, it was, to say the least, extremely irregular. Most extraordinary still, however, the scholarly world did not contest this transaction. When we asked Professor Norman Golb of the University of Chicago why so dubious a procedure was allowed to occur, he replied that opposing it would have been a lost cause. With DeVoe's behavior as a precedent, other members of his team followed suit. Thus, for example, when Father Patrick Skehan died in 1980, he bequeathed rights to the scrolls in his custody to Professor Eugene Ulrich of Notre Dame University, Indiana. The scrolls that had been the preserve of Father Gene Starkey were similarly bequeathed, or more euphemistically reassigned, to Father Emile Puac of the École Biblique. Thus, the Catholic scholars at the core of the international team maintained their monopoly and control, and the consensus remained unchallenged. Not until 1987, on the death of Father Bonneau, were their methods to be contested. When Father Bonneau died, Professor John Strugnell was designated as successor as head of the international team. Born in Barnet, North London, in 1930, Strugnell received his B.A. in 1952 and his M.A. in 1955, both from Jesus College, Oxford. Although admitted to the Ph.D. program at Oxford's Faculty of Oriental Studies, he never completed his doctorate, and his candidature lapsed in 1958. In 1954, he had been admitted to DeVoe's team and had gone to Jerusalem and remained there for 2 years. In 1957, after a brief stint at the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago, he returned to Jerusalem, becoming affiliated with the Rockefeller Museum, where he worked as epigraphist until 1960. In that year, he was appointed assistant professor of Old Testament studies at Duke University's Divinity School. In 1968, he moved to Harvard Divinity School as professor of Christian origins. Strugnell's appointment as head of international team was not entirely unimpeded. Since 1967, the Israeli government had been legally authorized to ratify all such appointments. In Father Bonneau's case, the Israelis hadn't bothered to exercise their authority. In Strugnell's, for the first time, they asserted their own rights over the material. According to Professor Shemaryahu Talman, a member of the committee that vetted Strugnell, his appointment was not ratified until certain conditions were met. Among other things, the Israelis were troubled by the way in which certain members of the international team tended to play the role of absentee landlord. Since the 1967 war, for example, Father Starkey had refused to set foot in Israel. Father Milek, DeVoe's closest confidant and protege, had for many years lived in Paris, with photographs of some of the most vital scroll material to which he alone has access. No one else is allowed to make photographs. Without Milek's consent, no one, not even on the international team, is allowed to publish on the material of which he has custody. To our knowledge, he has never, since the 1967 war, returned to Jerusalem to work on this material. Time magazine describes him as elusive. Another publication, Biblical Archaeology Review, BAR, has twice reported that he refuses even to answer letters from the Israeli Department of Antiquities. He has treated both other scholars and the general public with what can only be described as disdain. Anxious to discourage such behavior, the Israelis insisted that the new director of the scroll project spend at least some of his time in Jerusalem. Strugnell, who was reconsidering his position at Harvard in any case, complied by taking half retirement from his post. He began to spend half of each year in Jerusalem, at the École Biblique, where he had his own quarters. But there were other obligations which he failed to discharge. He did not publish the text entrusted to him. His commentary on one of these texts, a fragment of 121 lines, has been expected for more than 5 years and has still not appeared. He wrote only the 27-page article on the material in his possession. Apart from this, he published an article on Samaritan inscriptions, a translation of Milek's study of Qumran, and, as we shall see, a long and hostile critique of the one member of the international team to challenge the interpretation of the consensus. It is not a very impressive record for a man who spent a lifetime working in a field which depends on publication. On the other hand, he allowed selected graduate students to work on certain original texts for their doctoral degrees, thus earning prestige for them, for their mentor, and for Harvard University. In general, under Strugnell's auspices, the international team proceeded pretty much as they did before. It is interesting to compare their progress with that of scholars working on a different corpus of texts, the so-called Gnostic Gospels discovered in Egypt at Nag Hammadi. The Nag Hammadi scrolls were found 2 years before the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1945. By 1948, they had all been purchased by the Cairo Coptic Museum. There was initially an attempt to establish a Qumran-style monopoly over the material, again by an enclave of French scholars, and as a result, work on them was retarded until 1956. No sooner did it finally get underway than it was interpreted by the Suez Crisis. After this delay, however, the scrolls were in 1966 turned over to an international team of scholars for translation and publication. The head of this team was Professor James M. Robinson of the Institute for Antiquity and Christianity at Claremont Graduate School, California. When we spoke to Professor Robinson about the team in charge of the Qumran text, he was scathing. The Qumran scholars, Professor Robinson said, no longer have to make reputations. All they can do is break them. Professor Robinson and his team, in contrast, moved with impressive rapidity. Within 3 years, a number of draft transcriptions and translations were being made available to scholars. By 1973, the entire Nag Hammadi library was in draft English translation and was circulating free amongst interested researchers. In 1977, the whole body of the Nag Hammadi codices was published in facsimile and a popular edition. A total of 46 books, plus some unidentified fragments. It thus took Robinson and his team a mere 11 years to bring the Nag Hammadi scrolls into print. Granted, the Qumran texts were more numerous and posed more complex problems than those from Nag Hammadi. But even allowing for this, the record of DeVoe's international team does not exactly inspire confidence. When they were formed in 1953, their declared objective and intention was to publish all the scrolls found at Qumran in definitive editions, forming a series to be used by Oxford University Press as discoveries in the Judean desert of Jordan. The first volume appeared quickly enough in 1955 and dealt with the fragments found in the original cave at Qumran, now officially designated Cave 1. Not until 1961, 6 years later, did the next volume appear, and this did not deal with Qumran text at all, but with material found in nearby caves at Merabah. In 1963, a third volume appeared which dealt primarily with scroll fragments from Cave 2, Cave 3, and Cave 5 to 10. Of these fragments, the most complete and most important was the Copper Scroll, found in Cave 3. Apart from the Copper Scroll, the legitimate text amounted to just over 60 lines, and most came to something between 4 and 12 lines, but the fragments also yielded 2 copies of a text known as the Book of Jubilees. A copy of the same text would later be found at Masada, revealing that the defenders of the fortress used the same calendar as the Qumran community, and establishing closer connections between the two sites than DeVoe felt comfortable acknowledging. The fourth volume of Discoveries in the Judean Desert appears in 1965, under the editorship of James A. Saunders, but Professor Saunders was not a member of DeVoe's team. The scroll he dealt with, a volume of Psalms, had been found by the Bedouin in Cave 11 by 1956 and brought along with the numbers of fragments to the Rockefeller Museum. No purchaser being forthcoming, the material was locked in one of the museum's safes, to which no one was allowed access. Here it remained until 1961, when the Albright Institute was at last enabled to buy it, finance being provided by Kenneth and Elizabeth Batchel of the Batchel Corporation, a giant American construction company with many interests in the Middle East, though none in Israel, many connections with the American government, and at least some associations with the CIA. Professor Saunders' volume thus appeared independently of the framework and timetable established by DeVoe's international team. In the meantime, however, the bulk of the most copious and most significant material, the material found in the veritable treasure trove of Cave 4, continued to be withheld from both the public and the academic community. Now and again, small pieces and tantalizing fragments would leak into scholarly journals, but not until 1968 did the first official publication of material from Cave 4, albeit a very small proportion, appear. It did so under the auspices of the one renegade or heretic on DeVoe's team, John Allegro. As delays in releasing the Qumran material persisted and the time between published volumes continued to lengthen, suspicions began to proliferate that something was seriously amiss. Critics voiced three suspicions in particular. It was suggested that DeVoe's team were finding their material too difficult, too complex. It was also suggested that they might deliberately be proceeding slowly, suppressing or at least retarding the release of certain material in order to buy time. And it was suggested that the team were simply lazy and idle, basking in comfortable sinecures, which they would obviously be in no hurry to relinquish. It was further pointed out that no such delays had occurred with the pieces of Qumran material in American and Israeli hands. In contrast to DeVoe's team, American and Israeli scholars had wasted no time in bringing their material into print. The sixth volume of Discoveries in the Judean Desert did not appear until 1977, 9 years after Allegro's work. A seventh volume was not issued until 1982, an eighth only in 1990, and this latter did not deal with Qumran text. As we have noted, draft translations of Nag Hammadi codices were in circulation within 3 years. In the case of the Qumran material, no such draft translations were ever made available by DeVoe's team, nor are they so today. The entire Nag Hammadi corpus was in print within 11 years. It is now approaching 38 years since DeVoe's team began their work, and they have so far produced only 8 volumes, less than 25% of the material in their hands. As we shall see, moreover, of the material which has appeared in print, very little of it is the material that really matters. In an interview published in the New York Times, Robert Eisenman spoke of how a small circle of scholars has been able to dominate a field of research for several generations, even though some of these scholars have been defunct in this field for years, and to continue to do so through their control of graduate studies and placing their coterie of students and scholars in the most prestigious academic chairs. Biblical Archaeological Review, an influential journal published by the Washington lawyer Herschel Shanks, described DeVoe's international team as being governed, so far as can be ascertained, largely by convention, tradition, collegiately, and inertia. According to BAR, the insiders who hold the scrolls have the goodies to drip out bit by bit. This gives them status, scholarly power, and wonderful ego trip. Why squander it? And at the conference on the scrolls at New York University in 1985, Professor Morton Smith, one of the most distinguished names in contemporary biblical studies, began by saying scathingly, "I thought to speak on the scandals of the Dead Sea Scroll documents, but these proved too numerous, too familiar, and too disgusting." How have the members of the international team responded to such damning condemnation? Of the original international team assembled in 1953, only 3 at present remain alive. Joseph Millick, who has since left the priesthood, maintains, as we have seen, the life of an elusive recluse in Paris. Professors John Strugnell and Frank Cross were at Harvard University Divinity School. Of these, Professor Cross proved the most accessible and allowed himself to be questioned about the delays in publication. In an interview with the New York Times, he admitted that the progress had generally been slow and offered 2 explanations. Most members of the team, he said, were engaged in full-time teaching and could get to Jerusalem to work on material only during summer holidays. And the scrolls that have not yet been published, he added, are so fragmented that it is difficult to fit them together, much less translate them. "It's the world's most fantastic jigsaw puzzle," he remarked on another occasion. It would, of course, be rash to underestimate the complexity of the work in which Cross and his colleagues were engaged. The myriad fragments of Qumran text do indeed constitute a daunting jigsaw puzzle. Nevertheless, Cross's explanations are not altogether convincing. It is certainly true that members of the international team are active in teaching and have only limited time to spend in Jerusalem. But Cross did not mention that most of the work now being done on the scrolls is done with photographs, which do not require the researcher to travel anywhere. In fact, the state of photography at present often makes it easier and more reliable to deal with photographs than with original parchments. As for the complexity of the jigsaw, Cross himself contradicts his own argument. As early as 1958, he wrote that most of the scroll fragments then in the team's hands had already been identified, and been identified, in fact, by the summer of 1956. According to John Allegro, writing in 1964, assembly and identification of all Cave 4 material, the most copious corpus was nearly complete by 1960-61, nor was the task of identifying material always as difficult as Cross might lead one to believe. In a letter to John Allegro, dated the 13th December 1955, Strugnell wrote that 3,000 pounds worth of Cave 4 material had just been purchased with Vatican funds and identified in one afternoon. Complete photographs of the material, he added, would require no more than a week. Even before he breached the consensus of the international team, Allegro was anxious to speed things up and skeptical of the various reasons proffered for not doing so. But was it merely a sop that Devoe wrote to him on 22nd of March 1959 that all the Qumran texts would be published and discoveries in the Judean desert complete by the middle of 1962, the date scheduled for Strugnall's concluding volume? In the same letter, Devoe stated that work on the original text would be finished by June 1960, after which they would be turned over to the various institutions that had paid for them. Today, more than 30 years after Devoe's letter, survivors of this team and its new members still cling to the scrolls in their possession, insisting on the need for continued research. And it is worth repeating, what has voluntarily released is, for the most part at least, importance. The Qumran texts are generally classified under two rubrics. On the one hand, there is a corpus of early copies of biblical texts, some with slightly variant readings. These are referred to as biblical material. On the other, there is a corpus of non-biblical material consisting, for the most part, of documents never seen before, which can be labeled sectarian material. Most outsiders, needless to say, instinctively assume the biblical material to be of the greater interest and consequence. The simple word biblical triggers associations in the mind which lead automatically to such a supposition. To our knowledge, Eisenman was the first to detect and certainly the first to emphasize the sophistry involved in this. For the biblical material is perfectly innocuous and uncontroversial, containing no revelations of any kind. It consists of little more than copies of books from the Old Testament, more or less the same as those already in print, or with only minor alterations. There is nothing radically new here. In reality, the most significant texts comprise not the biblical, but the sectarian literature. It is these texts, rules, biblical commentaries, theological, astrological, and messianic treatises that pertain to the sect alleged to have resided at Qumran, and to their teachings. To label this material sectarian is effectively and skillfully to diffuse interest in it. Thus it is portrayed as the idiosyncratic doctrine of a fringe and maverick cult, a small, highly unrepresentative congregation, divorced from and wholly peripheral to the supposed mainstream of Judean and early Christianity. The phenomena to which it is in fact most pertinent. Outsiders are thus manipulated into accepting the consensus that the Qumran community were so-called Essenes, and that the Essenes, while interestingly as a marginal development, had no real bearing on broader issues. The reality, as we shall see, is very different, and the perfunctorily dismissed sectarian text will prove to contain material of an explosive nature indeed. End of chapter 2.